budget and tax, boy, what a terrible subject to have first thing in the morning. The decade of the 2000s was something of a surprise, I think. If you think about it, just go back about 15 years, we've gone from the era of big government is over to you didn't build that. And spending, you would have thought that government spending as the economy was growing during the 90s and during the 2000s, that government spending would go down as a percent of GDP. You would have been wrong. I'll just give you a couple of numbers here. Don't get scared because they're interesting numbers. Federal spending in 2001, 1.8 trillion. Federal spending this fiscal year, 3.8 trillion, more than double in a decade. Gross public debt in 2001, 5.7 trillion federal government, 576 billion state governments, 974 billion local governments. This year, federal debt, 16.6 trillion. That's up from 5.7 trillion in 10 years. State debt, 1.7 trillion. That's triple. And local debt is, let's see, that local debt is 1.7 trillion, which is more than double. State debt is 1.09 trillion, which is double. So total government spending in 2001, 34.7% of GDP. 2010, 40.75%. Here's a money quote for you. The Mercatus Center at George Mason University found that from 2000 to 2009 alone, real state and local spending grew 90% faster than real private sector gross domestic product. Federal government is now spending more than 25% of GDP. Did you know that during the Roosevelt administration before World War II, federal spending never went above 10.7% of GDP? The New Deal, the Roosevelt administration, 10.7% of GDP. It's now 25%. This is obviously sounds bad, but it gets worse. We have Tax-mageddon coming up. The rough estimate, $500 billion of additional tax burden if the tax cuts expire and Obamacare taxes kick in. It's $500 billion less that all the people around this room and in the businesses in your states and across the country will have to spend. And that means that their income is going to be less and your tax base is going to be less. Now, if we go off that fiscal cliff, it'll be interesting to see what it does to the tax reform movement. We have three representatives here who have, of that movement, who have been fighting the tax and budget wars in their states. Steve Anderson is the budget director for the state of Kansas. Christine Reese is a professor of economics at Georgia Tech and a senior fellow at the Georgia Public Policy Foundation. And Jonathan Small is a certified public accountant and is fiscal policy director for the Oklahoma Council of Public Affairs. They all have, as I say, in common the one thing that they've been fighting these budget wars. Their full bios are in the materials you've been given. And they also have several other things in common which will probably come out during our discussion. I'd like to throw it first to Steve, because I think the experiences that you all have had tell us a lot about the current budget and tax wars and apply to what's going on in other states and at the federal level as well. Steve, Kansas passed what you have described as the largest proportional tax cut in the history of the United States over the course of the next decade. Now, how did that come about? How did you do that?
And that's it. I'm glad you asked that, because we walked in, and if anybody wants some insight into HHS Secretary Sebelius, we walk into a budget. We have $876.05 in the bank, a state with over a $6 billion budget.
She was the governor.
She was the governor of Kansas for 2 terms, preceding Governor Brownback. We now have a $517 million ending balance. And it just goes to show that just simple application of business practices. It's really a process issue more than anything. The tax cut, now there was a lot of political maneuvering. We won't go into that. I think there's some interesting things that went on there, those of you that like inside baseball. But it was more about we wiped out the income tax on small business. That's where a big chunk of the cost was at. If you are an LLC, a sole proprietorship, a partnership, you have zero income tax now in the state of Kansas. We lowered our top rate from 6.45 to 4.9. We also lowered our lower rate to make sure, and it increased our standard deduction so we did not impact the lower brackets. And the fiscal impact under static analysis was $1.2 billion. Now that sounds like an awful lot of money, but when you can go from a $550 million deficit with $876 in the bank to a $517 million ending balance, that is a $1 billion swing we were able to do in 18 months by simply applying conservative practices and principles. I think it is easy to swallow that if you are willing to cut spending, and that is the key. I think a tax cut that doesn't have a fiscal note is not truly a tax cut, it's a reallocation. And I think Governor Brownback certainly believed that. And I think it's been amazing how easy it was to get it to a $517 million ending balance. In fact, the governor asked me to make the tool that we use to drive this available to every state. If you will go to the Kansas Division of the Budget, you can download our cost management system, which is an Excel platform. Every agency in your state should easily be able to download that and put their data in there. It's a very sophisticated Excel platform, but I think when you look at it, it's what private business does within their management information systems. It will allow you to look at the cost per unit of output right down to your individuals that are performing it. And that's how you get to a tax cut, is you do what business does. You look at processes. From 03 to 08, spending in Kansas increased by 46%. While during that same time, population will increase by 6%. Anyone says there isn't room to cut has not looked at the data.
Okay, how did you get the budget cuts? Were they where you said, well, we're going to take out this program at that program, or did you?
And that's the interesting part. We didn't eliminate many programs, because I think most of you understand, being legislators, that whenever you go after an existing program, the groups that have been living off of that descend on you en masse. It is very difficult to fight those battles. So we attacked processes, and that's why I mentioned the cost management system. It's amazing how much savings there is within existing programs. Now, we did do some things that I think were more principled than they were big dollar. For one thing, we did the equivalent of walking into a biker bar and calling out the biggest biker and whipping him in the street. We took on arts funding. And they came in mass to the Capitol. It wasn't quite like Scott Walker's fight in Wisconsin with the labor union, but you'd be surprised how many people turn out to defend $750,000. I think that principled stand, because prior to that I had a steady drumbeat of people coming to my office asking for money. After we stood up to the Arts Council and they realized that when you came to Governor Brownback, the first answer would be no, a lot less people came in. Mm-hmm. And I think there's something to be said for taking a principled stand so they understand, attack the processes just as business does all the time. You know, in private business, if you don't increase efficiencies by 3% every year, you're losing ground. We need to apply the same common sense business practices. And I think it's a tribute to the governor that if you look at his cabinet, you will see private sector people dominating that cabinet. He didn't bring the same old retreads in. He brought in people that had not been in political life, who had a fresh view of processes. And that really, it sounds simple, and it certainly is from a private sector view, but that is really how we were able to, I believe, $260 million of structural cuts is all we believe that will be necessary to handle this tax cut. And that's structural cuts. That's actual process changes that will ripple forward.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. I like the idea of going in and beating up the biggest guy in the bar. Sounds like a good lesson. Go
Sam,
ahead.
if I could jump in with
Sure.
what Steve said, you know, I think for lawmakers it's really important. I've got an interesting background. I worked for the legislature and I worked for a think tank. And what I've seen is that what happens when those that are free market minded take control of government, they're very tempted, because they don't want to rock the boat, to leave in the same bureaucratic staff that those that were opposed to the free market used to grow government for years. And I think that's why you've seen Kansas be successful when other states have been halted, like Oklahoma, is because it's impossible to think that you're going to pass free market policies if the current staff that you're using on your legislative staff and in other administrative agencies think like and do things that you ran against in your election. And so I think that's really important, to get true free market minded individuals on your staff. Otherwise, you're going to be thwarted, and we'll talk about it later, and they're going to sabotage your efforts down the road to try to enact policies that are going to bring about the reforms you're looking for.
Thanks. Christine, you had some success in Georgia. You passed a business tax reform, but you ran into a good deal of opposition, in particular the business about remaining revenue neutral. And this happened in a relatively conservative state, right, Georgia? So what does your experience tell you about the prospects for further tax reform in your state and how to deal with that issue of revenue neutrality?
Well, first of all, I want to say, apropos the morning's discussion, every time you hear anything about changing the country or the state, you're going to hear tax reform, which means lowering income tax rates, tax reform as 1, 2, or 3 of the issues that we have to tackle. And the reason that is because the kinds of cuts that we are talking about having to make are draconian. We cannot do them. We have to a good extent, grow our way out of this problem. So economic growth has got to be a part of anything that any of us do at the state or federal level. So we talk about economic growth. Again, in order to bail ourselves out of where we've gotten, we have to have economic growth. And a major part of that is tax reform, specifically lowering taxes on the activities that create economic growth. If you tax something, you're going to get less of it. If you tax income, you're going to get less of it. If you tax capital gains, you're going to get less. If you tax technology, if you tax investment, if you tax risk-taking, you're going to get less of it. So that's why tax reform is central to anything that we're doing. I do a lot of work with Heritage Foundation, and I will tell you that we have the preparations ready to go for January for tax reform for the nation. And that was the attitude that we went into it in the state of Georgia. And I was going to start by saying I was a member of the Simpson-Bowles Commission, which isn't exactly true. I was a member of the Special Counsel for Tax Reform in Georgia, which was sort of the equivalent. And we were tasked with not budget cutting. We were tasked with providing the optimal tax structure for the state. And there were 11 of us on that commission. We worked for about 6 to 8 months. Our recommendation was to be taken to the legislature and voted up or down without any legislative changes. So there were a number of us, many of us. Georgia is a very, very red state. And I often said when we started, if we can't get good tax reform, economic freedom, economic prosperity tax reform, pro-growth, if we can't get it passed in Georgia, you can't get it passed anywhere, because we had the numbers to do it. We didn't get it passed. So let me just quickly say that
Where did you get the go-ahead to do this? Was this
the leadership of both houses came together and decided, we need growth. We're a very fiscally responsible state. There wasn't much in the budget to cut, which is why we had to do revenue neutrality. We couldn't do a tax cut, and I often wondered, do you need to sweeten reform with a tax cut? Which is what we finally did last year, not the year before. But so we came at this problem, and there was one individual on the council who was responsible for generating the numbers, generating the fiscal notes. The group that he worked with historically was viewed as being a very liberal, raised taxes group. So that's where he was coming from with those numbers, and we had to rely on those numbers. But we came out with, pinch myself, the most perfect pro-growth tax reform plan that one could imagine. And I will tell you, Art Laffer was on my thesis committee. He's a friend of mine. In the middle of this whole process, when I would get confused or depressed or angry, he once sent me an email that had a Laffer curve on it, and in Latin on the side of it was written, "With this curve you shall conquer."
Art Laffer is a great economist.
They know who Art Laffer is. So I phoned his assistant and I said, "Oh shoot, he should have written that on a napkin for me." And 3 days later in the mail, I got the napkin, and I should have brought it to show you. Of course, it's probably worth a ton of money now. But anyway, and another time during when he seemed to get in trouble when the opponents came in and wanted to, we can't cut this, we can't do this, we can't change that. I called up Steve Moore at the Wall Street Journal. I said, help. And 2 days later in the Wall Street Journal, you can check it out, came an editorial called "The Anti-Illinois." And Because right at the point that Illinois raised its taxes so that it is now, I believe, still the highest corporate tax rate in the world, almost on the same day we issued our report. So our report was a wonderful, perfect, nearly perfect supply side report. And what happened pretty quickly, my redneck brother pointed this out to me. He said, "Sis, have you noticed that the conservatives are opposing this and the liberals are opposing this? Something's wrong." The Tea Party opposed it, and of course the liberals opposed it because it was regressive. So my experience since then has been really learning about the politics of it and why all that could happen. Again, if you can't do this, if you can't do the perfect system in the state of Georgia, you're going to have trouble anywhere, and we've really been learning from that.
You describe it as supply side, but there was
Absolutely.
But it was revenue neutral.
Well, it was not a tax cut.
Right. Okay.
And we felt that since our mandate was tax reform, we were not the legislature. We were not the persons to say that the budget should be raised or lowered. We just didn't think that was our charge.
Did you cut some rates and didn't? So you adjusted rates. You cut rates.
We cut rates. We took the brackets out. We cut rates. We proposed cutting a number of deductions and exemptions.
So for you, revenue neutrality included dynamic effects.
What we did mathematically was if we wanted to lower the income tax rate and we wanted to keep personal and corporate the same rate so that we didn't have changing back and forth, if we wanted to cut that, we had to get the money somewhere, which at the end of the day you have to do, and that's where the problem comes. So we would look around we could basically tax something that has not previously been taxed.
Broaden the base.
Broaden the base, which means you're going to tax something that hasn't previously been taxed, and there's where your opponents come out of the woodwork, right? So we have not got a state tax on food. Many states do. So we proposed putting the state tax back on food, which would get the income tax rate down by a percent from the 6% we currently are. So that's what revenue neutrality meant for us, is we were literally trying to say, we want to get our income tax rate down to 0. We want to be a zero tax state from 6%. We have got to find something else, because we can't cut spending all that much. We're pretty frugal. So we've got to find somewhere else to raise the revenue, and it would be on consumption, basically.
Relatively frugal.
Sam, I might say that I wish we could be in this case of Georgia, because Oklahoma has plenty of places to cut, and I know that probably for Kansas that they had the same situation as well. And what we found, the challenge that we found, is in the discussion of revenue neutrality, it's very interesting because if government is going to spend $1, then it has a multiplier effect of $1 million. If a citizen is going to spend $1, then it's retracted from the economy. They're stupid. They're going to stick their dollar under a mattress or perhaps burn it in their fireplace, and it'll never result in multiplier effects.
That's a joke, right?
What we that's really what they think. What we also found is it's very interesting is that your whether it's your college professors or your bureaucratic tax commission, ours is called the tax commission, or your revenue departments, they will come out and they'll price a tax cut, the government economists, and they'll say, they'll give you a static cut of $100 million. What they gave our static cut was somewhere in the range of $700 million in the first year. But what's interesting is when they're trying to predict for the legislature how much money you're going to spend, they use dynamic effects to determine the appropriation levels. So on the spending side, it works to figure out that sales taxes are going to grow, income taxes are going to grow. But when it comes on the tax cut side, again, your citizens are going to bury their dollars in a mattress. To give you an example of what happened in Oklahoma, Oklahoma was thwarted the last 2 years in its efforts, but up until 2010, Oklahoma had cut its top income tax rate from 7% all the way down to 5.25%. So what happened over that period of time? Doom and gloom was predicted. The sky was going to fall. Oklahoma was going to become a third world country, and my children were going to starve to death, and we would all be out of work. Actually, what happened is that Oklahoma's sales tax collections over an 8-year period grew by more than 50%. Our annual sales tax collections over the same period that we cut the personal income tax, 20%, have grown over $694 million a year. What's actually interesting, every time that the government bureaucrats predicted a tax cut, they were off. In fact, they predicted that the last 0.25% tax cut we were going to receive was going to result in the state losing close to $60 million for a half year, $120 million for a full year. You know what happened? Our income tax collections actually grew by $300 million. And then the sales tax collection growth that they ignored, it grew by $191 million. Now, curiously, they're not discussing that at all. And what's amazing about that is we had that kind of growth, and everybody's thankful for it right now. Oklahoma's not. Gross production, MCF is low right now. We had record low gas taxes or record low gross production levels, and we still had record growth in sales tax. So I think that's one of the challenges that we have, is that we've got to get people to either you believe that dollars are better spent by citizens or they're better spent by government. And I think that's one of the crises of beliefs that we've come to in Oklahoma is, do we really believe in freedom, and do we really believe that citizens know better what to do with their money than what we do?
And I'm glad, Jonathan, you cited that study, because I actually did the study on the income tax and sales tax. Thank you for setting that up, because that is part of what we use to go out and talk to our legislators about, to show them what could happen. You cut taxes by 21%, and this was the perfect case, and I encourage you to go to the Oklahoma Council of Public Affairs and look at this, because typically you don't have a good control group. Kansas during that decade stood pat, did nothing with their taxes, basically the same demographics. And what we saw was at the start of the decade, Oklahoma was collecting about $120 million more than Kansas. Kansas stood pat, and at the end of the decade, they're collecting $248 million more. That managed to move most of our conservatives and some of those that were on the fence. And those of you that are running for re-election, I'd ask you to look at, because typically the scare tactic they give you is, we're going to come after you if you cut our program funding. We had a primary election where we had 9 incumbent moderates that opposed the tax cut. 7 of them were defeated by conservative challengers, including political neophytes, just this last Tuesday, including the president of the Senate, who was president of NCSL, was defeated by a representative who was a conservative, had voted for the tax cut and stood on that in his re-election. He went from 30 points down to a 4% victory over the incumbent president of the Senate.
We're going to take questions from the audience in a couple of minutes, so if you can be prepared for that. I'd just like to sum up some of what you've been saying here. According to the latest edition of the annual Rich States, Poor States study by ALEC, over the past decade, the 9 states with no income tax on average saw 39.2% greater growth in economic output, 148% greater growth in population, and 81.7% faster growth in revenue than the average of the 9 states with the highest income tax rates. So you cut taxes and you get, 81.7% faster revenue growth. And I think that's a key element. We need dynamic scoring. And it seems that each of you had a different way of sort of sneaking in dynamic scoring into your discussion. We ready with any questions yet?
Can I
Go ahead,
first of all
Christine,
just
please.
say what actually did happen that was extremely positive in Georgia? The following year, people really wanted some kind of tax change done. So they managed to put together, right at the end of the session, with not a lot of time, what they called a pro-family, pro-business tax cut to revenue neutrality. So they managed to get the numbers so that it looked like there was a little bit of a tax cut. And they threw a bunch of things in there, like a sales tax holiday and so on, that we had not recommended. But what they did do was revamp, and it's not a sexy thing, but I tell you, the first week I know of 4 companies that decided to come to Georgia because of this. That is, we took the tax code that had been there since 1936, we streamlined it, we modernized it, we shrank it down, we reduced the paperwork that individuals, small businesses especially, would have to file to get their tax exemption. That is the sales tax exemption on business purchases. And that is going to have an absolute tremendous effect on the state of Georgia. As I said, I know of 4 companies in the first week after we passed that came. Taxes on energy and so on. We have reported, we just brought a facility from Japan, Caterpillar facility from Japan is going to invest in Georgia, and it would not have come if we hadn't passed that not sexy exemption on energy for business. So there's a lot of stuff that really, really matters to business that isn't the big conservative pro-growth tax cut thing. that is relatively easy to get by. And so I would urge everybody to look at that. It has a huge effect on the economy.
Hello? Oh, if you have any questions, just raise your hand and I can come bring the mic to you.
My question has to do with sort of the practicality of the various kinds of taxes. The income tax costs 22% on the private side to track all the transactions and keep all the records in order to figure out that you owe $1 of tax. So every dollar of tax you pay in the income tax, you're paying 22 cents on the private side to track everything, and that doesn't include the government side to administer it. With the gas tax that's collected at the gas pump, the cost on the private side runs about 0.5% to 1%. So in terms of trying to sell tax reform, have any of you tried to talk about the practicality of the various kinds of taxes? What's economically efficient, what's economically inefficient, and do you get any traction with that argument?
Actually, that didn't work in our, because we had some of those. I'm a private practice CPA. I'm not typically a government employee. I was just pulled out of the private world, and part of Brownback's whole approach is to bring the private sector in. And having prepared those returns, I absolutely concur with you that there are burdens that produce absolutely no economic benefit. However, the issue is a lot of the, especially on the income tax, it's often the federal rules that are the problem. And so we just kind of piggyback on the state. So it was a little hard to sell that. I definitely agree with my panelists that in streamlining, there are ways that you can make it easier and reduce some. Small business is particularly onerous. The larger companies hire specialists like me to come in and do that work. Small business, it impedes their growth and often impedes their formation. So I think you make a great point. But as she points out, it's not sexy. It's hard to explain. You know, and as our governor has pointed out, we are going to pull the income tax out by the roots so it can't regrow. So at the end of the day, that will take care of our paperwork issues. We're not stopping at 4.9 on the personal individual tax. 0 is our goal. So we want 0 state income tax for everyone.
We did look at a number of those and found a number of ways, like there, if we could show that, and there were a large number of people whose taxes would go up by, say, $50 a year. And we'd say, you know, your tax preparation costs are going to go down by a lot more than that. But the problem, I think, that I came up to, and I think this is why the groups on both sides opposed a lot of what we said, people don't trust the government anymore. You can tell them, oh, this, or this is logical, or here's this number, but, and I know I then went out and started speaking to a lot of Tea Party groups, and one of the ones I went to, there were 3 women in the front row who just hated me. Well, I am a university professor, and they looked like they'd eaten lemons, you know. They hated me, and I could feel this anger from the audience, and finally I said, look, I don't trust the government either. The whole place just deflated. And I realized then, whenever you're saying, you know, here's this, now increasingly, it's this number, or it's this, they just go, yeah, right, my taxes are going up. And they just don't believe it. So I think you cannot argue anything on the basis of trust me, trust the numbers, trust the academics.
They've learned from history.
And certainly that is exactly the feedback because actually we were going to drop the individual income tax to 3%. But we were going to have to do that by eliminating Schedule A deductions, which are your mortgage deduction, your charitable deduction, your other itemized deductions. When the different groups came in, you know, our argument to them was, we will put a ratchet in place that will eliminate the income tax. They made it very clear they didn't trust us.
That's exactly right.
So that's why we ended up only at 4.9, because we had to leave the Schedule A's in, and that's part of why our fiscal note was $1.2 billion too. However, I think that is one of the problems. If you look forward to get them to trust you, because even with the ratchet, which would have been any amount of income over a 3% growth would go to buy down the income tax, they knew that could be repealed. And knowing that, they didn't trust that it would stay that way. So they weren't willing to give up their Schedule A's. And at the end of the day, we said we would bite the bullet and go ahead and work our way to 0. It will take longer, but I think the government trust issue certainly is a problem you'll run into with your constituents.
Just briefly, isn't there also the difficulty of dealing with the fact that the federal government lays so many costs on the states? And in order to cut back, you're going to have to deal with that.
Well, you get the maintenance of effort. I will tell you, within a week of our tax cut passing, it's like the federal government had decided their job was to torpedo our tax cut. I have a call from HHS attempting to force me into an expansion of our DD waiver waiting list. I get a call from the SEC, who doesn't even have authority in the bond market. And then I've got the Department of Education giving me a maintenance of effort warning on our special education, all which have ratcheted up by 21% over the last 3 years. So it's certainly, that's part of the problem, the maintenance of effort issues that roll down from the federal government. And I won't go in great length how we beat all three of those issues. But if there's any of you legislators that would like to discuss our strategy to deal with it, because I think the governor, who has been a U.S. senator for a long period of time, understood how to deal with the federal government. And there are ways to deal with your maintenance of effort. And part of it is your accounting. And that's my little particular niche. But certainly there are ways to deal with that. And the federal government, with the current regime in Washington, certainly I think is an impediment to your tax accountability.
And if I could say on that, and that then goes right back to who your staff is. In Kansas, they have staff who is telling the federal government no every day. And in other states, they have staff that are playing footsie and complicit with the federal government and signing up for every single federal grant that's possible. So if you have big spending-minded bureaucrats in your agencies, in your legislative offices, I know I sound like a broken record, they are going to outmaneuver you while you're on break and add other programs and then show up at your door and use the terms maintenance of effort. And I think for states, a big thing is we all have to tell the federal government no. We have to forget this phony, baloney notion that, that if we don't take the money, somebody else is going to take it. No, actually, if we would all quit taking the money, then your kids and my kids won't have to worry about tax rates of 75%.
And you know, it's interesting, if you'll go back to your state government, if we exclude K through 12 and higher education in Kansas, 52.7% of my state payroll is federal. Now, they will argue with you they cover all the costs. Look at your unfunded liability in your pension system. And look at how the Office of Management and Budget, Circular A-87, which controls how you deal with the federal government, they will not pay any share of the unfunded liability if it isn't paid within 18 months of the time that grant lapses. So basically, we are stuck, and consider 52.7% of my payroll is federal. We are stuck with a big chunk of our unfunded liability actually being accumulated federal debt by accepting those grants. And that has been the instruction that has gone out to our people. When they offer you a carrot, look long and hard at that. And we're not taking an awful lot of that new federal money. And I think that Jonathan brings a great point up there, is now's the time for the states to start to refuse that federal money because it comes with strings.
Question up front.
You all kind of touched on the area that I was going to, Mr. Anderson, Mr. Small. Dealing with entrenched bureaucracies is a real challenge for those of us in states that have been traditionally dominated by liberal policies, and that entrenched bureaucracy is very, very difficult to deal with. I'd like to hear some of your strategies for addressing that as you attempt to enact conservative policies. What should we be looking to do to counteract the effects of that entrenched bureaucracy?
Well, I would just suggest one thing: download that cost management system. When people start understanding they're going to be measured, I'll give you just an anecdotal. Our Department of Labor, and while that's all federal money, that is one of the most wasteful departments because it's FUTA money. It bounces to Washington and bounces back, so nobody watches it. So we knew that was the perfect place to put the CMS system in first to test it. She currently is working with about 30% less employees than she had. Dropped calls went from 13,000 a week to 500 a week once they knew they were going to be measured. And you'd be surprised how many people went ahead and retired when they found out they were going to be measured. And that's part of the way you attack it. You attack it on the ground level. That's where the rubber meets the road attack. The other way, and I think it needs to be done for maximum efficiency, and we're lucky to have in our situation a strong governor position where the governor, when he appoints the cabinet secretary, they actually run the agencies. So if you look at who his cabinet is, you don't see a bunch of ex-legislators who their whole, and nothing against being a legislator, but my grandfather was one, but you don't see ones who their whole life is in political science. Our Ag Secretary is a former Cargill exec. Our Health and Environment is a former doctor. Our Aging Secretary is a former nursing home administrator. And basically they came in, they lopped that level of management under them off because those are unclassified employees, much like when I walked into my office, 24% of my employees are not with me anymore. My budget's been shrunk by 25%. I'm going to shrink it by another 13.2% this next year. But I went in, I looked for people that understood us philosophically and were ready to go down the road with us. And that was my talk to my staff, who were all unclassified, that either you are with us or it's a good time to look for another job. And you know, you hate to be that blunt, and within the classified system you have to be careful. But certainly, if you put the CMS system in, that will force some changes at the rubber meets the road. And if you have the ability to bring in cabinet secretaries and leadership that is private sector, I cannot encourage that enough, because they made my job really easy. And some of the things they did, I'll be happy to talk to you all about in detail in the various areas. But it's amazing when you bring a private sector guy in, how they look at things different. Because I don't care how efficient any government entity claims they've been, they're nowhere near as efficient as the private sector, and you will find savings.
You know, one thing I might say to that, because your question leads to a problem that we're having in Oklahoma. So you may get conservative lawmakers that are elected, but much of your bureaucracy are, you know, liberals who want to spend more money. And I think what's important is to get with groups like the Heartland Institute and your other think tanks, but then also use your news media to highlight significant amounts of waste. And even the smallest amount of things you'll find will help turn the population in your favor. And that's one of the things that I would strongly recommend that you do is, and it does take some of your time, but to begin to focus on the ridiculous things that government is doing with people's money, and then pit that against core services. Take a program that money is being spent on something that's insane and compare it to what you could do to raise a teacher's salary. Because then that will begin to help get the public and the media on your side to do some of that work for you. And that's the only way that you're going to be able to change that, is to tap into the general outrage that people have. And like she said, the general skepticism that they have. If you can be the one to help expose that, and others with you, that will help them begin to see the need for change and the need for staff to change.
Yeah, I'd like to sort of put these comments all under the category of transparency. And so one of the problems that we had with tax reform is that the numbers were not reliable even to those on the council. And so what we have done is I have the taxpayer numbers now, and we are in the process of putting them online, all disguised and so on, so that the population, the people of Georgia, can make their own tax reform plan. So that it's going to be transparent. They're going to be able to look at the numbers. They're going to be able to see that if you have to raise this, you can lower that. And there are many people out there who are very anxious to get in, who haven't been in politics before, who are anxious to get involved, who are outraged, and are looking for a way to do the analysis, figure out what to do, and how to get on the side to make it happen.
We got a question back here.
Yeah, Roman Bueller with the Madison Coalition. This is a federal tax question, and you may not have thought about it before, but we've seen the federal government try to impose its will now by imposing a tax on people for not buying a service. Ed Meese had an idea when he was Reagan's Attorney General to give states the power to propose a specific amendment. What do you think about an amendment that says a constitutional amendment that says the federal government cannot impose a tax for failure to purchase a service?
I think it's going to be unanimous up here. We're all going to agree that that's a great amendment. In fact, we're trying to put that in the state constitution of Kansas. The 9 moderates that were, 7 of them were defeated by conservatives, were the ones that blocked that last session. We certainly believe that will be one of the first issues that runs through the legislature, and I think it will fly through there like a freight train. And I can assure you that the governor of Kansas will sign that with great pride.
And I do think that that's a good thing as well. But I think states, just like the congressman mentioned this morning, states are a lot to blame for what's going on. And you won't send a message to the federal government like the message that's sent that we're not going to take your money anymore. And I think that's going to be tough to do, and there's going to be some heartburn. But amendments don't really bother them. Stop taking their money, because then they can't force you to do anything. Force them to have to actually come into your state and make you implement a welfare program.
Got another question back here.
Tom Drake from Indiana. I live in a suburban community about 30 miles from here in northwest Indiana called Munster, Indiana. Very middle class to upper middle class, excellent school system. Recently, the public school officials came out and said, we need more money. We want to float a referendum to increase property taxes. And if you don't get it, we're going to cut the orchestra, on and on. And the Munster school system is excellent. Then what they did was they did a telephone survey asking people, are you willing to accept a tax increase? It got a slam dunk no. It's not, in Munster is a Republican-controlled town, well managed. It doesn't have the bitterness and hostility that you have in a lot of places. But people have their backs to the wall. They're concerned about the future of the economy. They're concerned about their jobs. And it's not just the poor, the working class, the lower middle class who are faced with these problems. It's middle class and upper middle class people, and they've had it with the taxes. They don't want it anymore. And that's that. I wish the Republicans would get that in their heads and act on it. And not so-called, let's get along with the Democrats, let's not get too ugly. They're always going to demand more taxes and more government. And of course, they're running dogs, so-called rhinos. I'm sick of it myself as a grassroots Republican.
Well, I think I shared the sentiment. I think that there's people that share the sentiment of your frustration, but we've seen in our own state of Oklahoma that's vastly majority controlled by Republicans that an addiction to spending is not just a Democrat or Republican problem, it's a politician problem. And even when you get states that have overwhelming majority controls, I know from the Midwest, a lot of what you're seeing is it's Democrats, but Oklahoma is #1 in total state spending growth, even though Republicans control every single branch, statewide office, and they vast majority control the legislature. So the problem is spending. Until we all together start saying no, we're going to continue to see that frustration in our constituents.
It's bubbled up in both chambers. Fortunately, we had a governor that feels exactly like you do. And we stood up and we actually cut spending last year. We intend to cut it by $260 million this next year. And I think that's, the citizens have really warmed to that as they've seen. And the problem is the spenders come out and tell you services will be impacted. You all know how it works. It's that first year that you cut spending and they see that nothing happens, that the schools are still operating well, that people are getting taken care of. Then you start getting traction. And that's why it took us till the second year to get the tax cut. We wanted to do it the first year because you'd like to do it when you're full of energy. But that's what it took. It took that first year of actually cutting spending.
I think it's clear that obviously to raise revenues, you have to cut tax rates and broaden the base. And you'll find the documents that we have back there, the Heartland publications, 10 Principles of State Fiscal Policy, 10 Principles of Federal Tax Policy, 10 Principles for Improved Business Climates, all make that very clear. But one thing I think I learned from this panel today is that it really comes down to working the details. And you can't just have some grand program, okay, we're going to cut. People aren't going to want to hear that. But if you say, and especially as you said, they're very cynical about the government ever actually cutting anything. But getting down to the details and saying, well, this is how it's going to work. I'd like to conclude on that point. Any final thoughts? Oh, okay. If we have a question, sure. Oh, over here.
Hello.
Okay, sorry, this isn't an ending question, but more of a detailed one. Tax increment financing. Any discussion or thoughts on tax increment financing reform? Tried to address it this year in Iowa and didn't get very far.
I think that's the principle of the reason the tax code is so bad is because government likes to pick winners and losers. And what's interesting is that your state chambers and your large business industries will be some of the people that will fight you the hardest on things like tax increment finance reform. And again, I think that goes to where you have to have, you can't do that by yourself. You've got to have an apparatus where your grassroots organizations are sharing with the public how this is the ridiculous argument that we had in Oklahoma. Tax rates don't matter. You don't need to cut taxes, except for the aerospace industry. For some reason, an aerospace engineer needs an income tax credit. But a petroleum engineer or a plumber or a teacher, they don't care about the income tax. And those are the kinds of comparisons that I think we have to start getting into, where we're saying, okay, well, why is it that this industry, they'll respond to an incentive, but all the rest of us, we don't care? And I think that's some of the things that we've got to start doing, is we've got to start making our principles personal to families. The left does a really good job of, running a screen of, someone in a wheelchair being pushed off a cliff because of Medicare reform. We've got to get a lot better at showing the family who's stuck in a bad school district, who can't send their kid to private school because the state wants to hold on to its income tax.
And that goes back to Christine's point about transparency.
I think we have time for one more question.
Yes.
Thank you. I'm Senator Pugh from Maryland, Baltimore, Maryland, and a business person as well. And I can't think of anyone, if you gave them a survey and asked them if they wanted to pay additional taxes, would say yes. I think everybody would say no, Democrat or Republican. And I agree with your 10 principles of state fiscal policy and improving business climates. But when America sends most of its jobs overseas, and I'm a witness that when you do cut taxes, in some cases, public services do retreat and schools do fall apart, living in a city with 47,000 boarded up houses. So what is your proposal for fixing those kinds of situations? Thank you.
It hasn't been an issue with us. We've actually seen that the amount of money we put in the classroom went up. It's an allocation issue. Often when you go and look at, and I'll put it as simple as it really is, it's a matter of what the government wants to do and what it needs to do. We've got an awful lot of things we do that aren't essential functions of government. If we get down into doing what we need to do, and we stay away from the things that sound like the Arts Commission, that's why we called them out first, because they were the most obvious example. But we eliminated funding to a number, or reduced it significantly to a number of other of the wants, without completely eliminating the program, so we didn't have the total fight. So we could reallocate to K through 12 education and to transportation. But I'm not sure I buy that. I have 17 teaching certifications, riveting subjects like math and physics. And I don't know as it's a matter of the amount of money in the classroom. And I think Governor Christie put it best when he was talking about the teachers, and said when he was told that there was a number of teachers who were going to leave the state because he was freezing their pay for a year. If they're only in the classroom because their interest is simply dollars, do we have the right teachers?
And I think one of the things we found in Oklahoma, just from being a budget analyst and a fiscal policy director, is that in our education bureaucracies, both Common Ed and Higher Ed, they're insane. There's been great work that's been done by people that have shown that, the typical administrative level 50 years ago in school was somewhere between 10 and 20%. In Oklahoma now, we have more administrators than we actually have teachers. So that's your problem, when 51% of your spending is on administrators and not actually teachers. And so it's actually the way it's supposed to work. If you give people back more of their money and a district has too much administration and it has to close, that's exactly what's supposed to happen.
Let me first of all say it is not the case that we are sending all our jobs overseas. One thing economists agree on is a free trade. We insource so much more than we outsource. So that is something we want to put aside. But I think with all of these arguments, things have got to be shifted around. Funds have got to go towards job creators. That means somebody else is going to have to give up a deduction or pay somewhat more in another area. But if everybody pays a little bit more, gives up a little deduction over lots of people, we can do it. And what people need to see is, I may have to pay $50 more a year or $50 more a month, or I may have to give up this deduction, but it means I'm going to get a job. People have got to make that trade-off, because unless we have somebody giving up things that they have now or expectations that they have now, we're going to continue with this unemployment. So it is literally change what we're doing, rebalance, and shift things towards the job creators and get more jobs, or keep going and the job picture will continue to shrink.
Thank you, Chris.
I actually have to disagree a little bit with that. Come to Kansas, you won't pay more, and we have one of the lowest unemployment rates in the nation. We're not going to incrementally increase your tax. We're going to pull it up by the roots.
Perfect example of tax competition between the states. A very good thing. I want to thank our panel. Go ahead. We're going to go right into the next panel, which is going to be on energy policy. But I want to encourage you to talk with Steve Anderson, Christine Reese, and Jonathan Small if you get a chance. I'm very impressed by what they've said, and I think we've learned a lot, and there's plenty more to learn. Again, thank you very much.